dangers to the decentralization of Bitcoin, which is another way of saying, as you said at the beginning, Bitcoin has started centralized in the mind of Satoshi. It's become very decentralized. Well, probably the most decentralized thing we have, definitely in terms of money, the most decentralized digital money we have. Maybe you could argue gold is more decentralized as physical. I don't know. But now you're identifying certain dangers that could cause it to regress. Hardware manufacturing is one. We've sort of alluded to that earlier. You talked about mining pools, but nodes is an interesting one. Another way Bitcoin's been described is like a system of very aligned incentives, or near, what did I say? It's like a vortex of positive incentives that causes itself to proliferate, right? It's basically paying everyone to make it succeed.
Yeah.
But one area, well, maybe two areas where this is weak is nodes. There's not a very direct financial incentive for people to run nodes. There is maybe an incentive in the sense if they want to avoid being scammed or rug pulled or sent false transactions, some technical reasons to run a node.
Privacy is a good one.
Privacy. And then the other one was Bitcoin developers. Like although there have been some workarounds for this, right? Like people creating funds and whatnot. These seem to be maybe two weak points in terms of Bitcoin's positive incentive schema. What do you think the fixes are to those, to getting more people to run nodes, and if you agree with them, and getting more people to be Bitcoin developers?
Yeah, so it's been a cultural trope to run a node, right? And it became kind of a virtue signal and a bit cringe as well, because if you don't use your node, it doesn't really do anything, right? So, but it was a big thing. Like we did fight a war over it, and we did win that war, kind of. Like there's a caveat there, but we basically did. The right guys won in 2017. Incentivizing node running is difficult because you don't get paid for it. You're just supposed to do it for your own benefit. But expecting people to understand the benefit, like it's like that thing, like the market is, assumes people make economically rational decisions, but that people make economically irrational decisions. They do it all the time.
Yeah.
And some of that can be because it's morally, like, that morality plays into people's decisions too. So people will spend more on a product that's more ethical, right? That's not economically rational, but it's another factor. So getting people to run nodes is hard, and getting people to use their nodes is even harder still, because the ecosystem just doesn't lend itself to it. Nonetheless, by grace of God, we have enough people running nodes to be able to genuinely claim decentralization. So, I mean, and when it comes to core development as well, that's I'm not going to get into it because that's fraught with issues too. But it is what it is.
Fraught with issues in terms of not having enough developers.
Just more like the expectations versus reality. Like I did a poll on Twitter recently where I said Bitcoin Core is a meritocracy. It's immune from politics. I created a deliberate straw man. It's immune from politics. Not a single line of code gets in there unless it is reviewed and vetted and found to be, correct and what it should be. And most people voted yes, and it's not true at all, right? Like, of course, there's social heuristics getting used. Most people aren't reviewing it. If one guy proposes it, everyone just acts it, which is like approved on GitHub. If someone people don't like recommends it, then it gets downvoted. And that's just like people, right? Like, let's not be naive and think there's no politics in core development. Of course there is. Like,
sure.
So I just sort of was like, whoa, people are we're high on our own supply a bit when it comes to how how decentralized and how much of a meritocracy it really is. I just think that was, I still think core development's pretty good, but I just think we think it's better than it is, right?
Right.
Like let's be honest with ourselves, right? It's the way funding works is super centralized. The way mining is getting is incredibly centralized, and that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
And you have a trend towards centralization in certain areas of it. So you have to pick up on those and not become boiled frogs, in my opinion.
What then so the big theme is, again, dangers to Bitcoin's decentralization. It's been on a really good path so far. Maybe it's starting to regress along these certain verticals or domains, whatever you want to call it. how do we check that? How do we reverse course? What are you guys doing at Ocean to push the decentralization of Bitcoin further? Like, what should people be thinking about? It's very easy to just say, oh, we've got Bitcoin and it's decentralized and we're done here. It's like, well, that's not the case. It's an ongoing process. It's a garden that we always have to weed. Like, what particular spots of the garden should people be paying attention to?
Yeah, so great topic. So there's been a conflation of hashing, which is a part of the mining process, and mining, which is more than just hashing. So the process of Bitcoin mining is in its entirety is running a node, downloading and verifying the entire chain, creating a template for a new block that builds on top of the longest proof of work chain, having a mempool, finding unconfirmed transactions and using them to populate the block, then hashing, where you try and solve the block, which is the number guessing part of it. Then if you get lucky and solve the block, submit it to the network and you've just added one block to the chain. That hashing part is what people that call themselves Bitcoin miners do, but the rest of it is done by a tiny group of people, and that's not harmless. That's a choke point, and it's become incredibly centralized, and it's much worse than it looks, is the main thing I'm sounding the alarm about, because these are the people that decide what goes in the blockchain. That's not an innocuous thing, and you can't just rely on top-down lucrative motivations of we'll run a mempool and we'll start with the most lucrative transaction, go down from there until we fill up the block, and then we'll keep iterating on that every few seconds as new transactions come in. We'll just substitute in any low-paying one with a higher-paying one. Oh, we found a block. Like, that's a very naive heuristic. If the person doing that is a regulated giant entity inside the United States, the idea that they will continue doing that and respect neutrality of Bitcoin transactions is incredibly low. That's something that might work for a while, but it's not something we can say we've built a resilient, anti-fragile system if we're relying on one party to be like, everything that goes in the chain is dictated by me. And once I make these templates that aren't blocks, right? They haven't done the proof of work, the hashing component, but they still designed what goes in the chain. They send it out to all their miners or hashers who then solve the block, and if they get lucky, it gets added to the chain. But the hasher, the one doing the proof of work, didn't have any say or interest or concern even about what ended up in that block. They were completely removed from that element of mining. So it's not a tragedy. It's not the end of the world. And Bitcoin demonstrably works at the moment anyway, but that's not a resilient system. Like I said, there's no redundancy there, because if and when someone comes and holds a gun to the head of this tiny group of people that are deciding what goes in the chain, there's nowhere else for miners really to go. They're captured, they're stuck in the places they're forced to use. They're addicted to this payout model where the person constructing those also smooths out their revenue. They've become very addicted to that, and they've become completely unconcerned with the process of template construction, which needs to be decentralized, right? So you have massive decentralization of hashes. They're all around the planet, but they're all getting put through this funnel, gatekeeping, as you put it, of here's what goes in the blockchain. And it's basically dictated by, I think 90% of blocks are what comes out of them and what goes into them is dictated by 3 pairs of hands, which is obviously centralized. And the fact that that's not a concern tells me that, to me, that's like saying it doesn't matter if PayPal deplatform me because you have Venmo, you have Cash App, you have alternatives. I'm like, that's not a resilient, redundant system. That's just hopping around from centralized service provider to service provider. That's not redundancy. That's not decentralization. That's way harder. Like, you could run Bitcoin with one node, right? And that's what shitcoiners do. They're like, it's good enough. We didn't get shut down. I'm like, yeah, but that's not credible, right? You need like tens of thousands of them. So every miner should be also responsible for designing blocks and seeing what goes in there. And my fantasy for this is just, you want to come along, your US government or your Chinese government pointing a gun at Bitmain's head, or your US government pointing a gun at Foundry's head, which is already over 50% of the network, just the combination of those two. What I want is, currently it's the world where they say, we want you to exclude this or comply with this transaction blacklist or something like that. Right now, if they did it, there'd be backlash and the community would be very annoyed with them, but it would be a real thing they could actually do. In the world we're building, which are pretty close to, where all of the miners individually participating on those pools are all constructing templates locally rather than getting the pool to do it for them. In that world, it becomes a joke. Rather than a naughty thing you shouldn't do that's against the ethos of Bitcoin, but you can do it, it becomes a joke. Like, oh, wow, this guy is censoring transactions. Amazing. There's 10,000 other people that are just as likely to find a block as them who aren't going to do that. So then it becomes laughable, right? And it's like, you can't, the Second Amendment doesn't give everyone a nuclear bomb, but it does give everyone a rifle. Like that's relatively decentralized, right? And that has consequences. It does, it does make things freer. It does make us more sovereign because it's simple enough and it's distributed enough that it's like credible. So you want every miner doing the whole mining process, and then mining's decentralized. That's what you want. And we're not far away from it. It's going to be beautiful when it comes out. Every single block on it, because you look at the timeline on mempool.space, and you'll see like Foundry, Antpool, Foundry, Antpool, F2Pool, Via, Foundry, Antpool,
This is
Foundry.
the sequence of who's solved the most recent blocks.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
You'll just look at these same actors, find the same pools. And what makes it really bad is so many of the small pools that are supposed to give us some decentralization are all just Antpool under the hood. And they're not really hiding it all that well, but the fact that they're hiding it at all suggests that, they're acting in their own interests, and their own interests are against the interests of the wider network, which is fine. But in the past, people would migrate away from them if they did that, and they're not doing that now, which is why I say we have boiling frog syndrome.
Wow. What? So do you see this? I mean, if what you're describing is true, then this model would eat Bitcoin mining over time, right? Because why would anyone go to one of these? Do I call them centralized pools? Is that what they are today?
Well, they present the best cash flow. That's why they go there, and they also satisfy some regulatory.
But they're getting milked, though, right? I mean, to pick up that certainty and pay for that shield against the uncertainty, they're paying a tax for some fee that sounds like it's hard to calculate.
They're definitely losing a lot of money.
They're losing money. So if that were true and they had the option, and maybe it takes a while for this knowledge to permeate people's mind and get out there, but at some point, if this were all true, presumably everyone would switch to this model and away from the existing smooth payout model.
Yeah. I think most people's intuition is that if I do this thing that's better for Bitcoin, it's going to come at the cost of my bottom line. That is people's usual intuition, right? Like the decentralized model is going to be less efficient because that's just the nature of decentralization, and I'm going to make less money. Weirdly, that's not the case. Weirdly, if you come and do what helps Bitcoin out, you also earn more money. The too good to be true element comes in with the fact that the transparency of what we do and the fact that we only pay miners when we find blocks as a result means cash flow gets disrupted. Like we will go, because we're tiny at the moment, we will go multiple days without blocks, and that's going to be annoying for miners to deal with. And I think right now a lot of them are rational, not jumping on our pool. Fair enough. But if we're 3 or 4x the size we are now, which should be in the process of happening, it's kind of like a party. Like no one wants to be the only guy at the party. Like you need how many people is a party? I don't know.
Right. No one was just saying in commercial real estate, never be the first guy on the block kind of thing. Does this model then preclude the possibility of a collaborative structure where people can have smoother payouts? Is it binary?
No, it doesn't, because it gets very smooth pretty quick. Okay. So right now we're at 1.2 exahash, which is tiny, right? It's like 0.1% of the entire network. So we're finding blocks pretty rarely, but it already trended and hit 100% of expectations, because you'll fall below 100% of the blocks you expect, and you'll go above it, and you should trend towards 100%. Occasionally, you're not going to fit that, and you'll deviate from it because difficulty adjustments happen. And if you get unlucky in one and then the difficulty jumps up, you might never make that back. But regardless, you need to be finding, I don't know, I'm going to say like at least 10 or 11 blocks every epoch, right? Otherwise, you might just miss out on low difficulty periods. So there's a minimum size a pool can be before it's practical. That's why you can't just have 10,000 mining pools and we decentralize everything that way. Doesn't work. Like, a pool needs to step up, be big enough, but also be transparent and non-custodial to the point where the miners, if they all use that pool, aren't a systemic risk to Bitcoin. So if everyone's mining on Ocean, doesn't matter. The miners are basically solo mining because they're all constructing their own templates, and as many of them as possible are getting paid out from the Coinbase. So there isn't some giant entity that is designing everything that goes in the chain and taking custody of everything that comes out of it. That's centralization, right? We cannot have that. And Ocean breaks all of that. It just says all we do is coordinate splits. So you're 20%, you did 40% of the work, you did 10% of the work, and the remaining 30%, if I did the numbers right, we'll split that accordingly. We'll define how the Coinbase split works. We don't do anything else. We don't construct the block template. We don't take custody of the coins coming out. And if someone holds a gun to our head, there's nothing we can do. We could screw with one block and annoy everyone and go out of business, and that would be the end of it. Someone would just do an alternative, and hopefully we would have raised the bar for what's acceptable in Bitcoin, which is, I'm a miner, but I demand my pool not take custody of my coins, and I demand that everything they do is transparent. I'm not going to accept anymore mining for a pool that doesn't give me any insight into how what I did relates to what I was paid. That's not good enough. And if they take custody of all new coins as well, that's a risk to me I could do without.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.